Welcome to Marian University and our Global Studies Speaker Series. This is the 16th year of the series, and the first time in the history of the series that we are live streaming this talk on our Facebook page. Before I introduce Senator Lugar as our speaker tonight, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Global Studies program and our speaker series. So the Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies consists of two major parts. One is the academic program in Global Studies. It's a minor in Global Studies that fits with any major at Marian University in the liberal arts and sciences or the professional studies of nursing, education, and business. And we have students who minor in Global Studies in all of these programs. And the Global Studies minor consists of specially designed courses in Global Studies taught by different disciplines at Marian University, as well as additional language, foreign language study, and a required study abroad experience. So it's a value-added component to every degree at Marian, and all of our students get a lot out of it. We have several Lugar Fellow scholarship students here in the audience, as well as other Global Studies students, as well as people from the general community. In addition to the minor in Global Studies and the Lugar Fellow Scholarship Program, we also have our speaker series. And as I said, this is the 16th year, and I'm hoping that on your way in you picked up the brochure for this speaker series. And I just want to bring your attention to what's coming up next. In February, we will have, I believe, our 13th annual event with Catholic Relief Services, and this will be on rebuilding refugees' lives in Sri Lanka with Sajith Silva, who is the Catholic Relief Services Program Director for Sri Lanka, and he'll be talking about basically refugee resettlement in post-Civil War Sri Lanka. It should be very interesting and a very moving program. In March, we will be hosting the Consul General of Mexico, Luis Franco, who will be speaking on U.S.-Mexican relations from a diplomatic perspective, and that'll be a really interesting program as well. And then finally, in April, we will be hosting an executive from the NASA Marshall Flight Center speaking on the future of deep space exploration and the journey to Mars. So we will be going from global to extraterrestrial, I guess, with that one. All of our events are free and open to the public. You're most welcome to attend. Students, invite your parents and grandparents and friends to come, and please always invite more people to come. Now, it is a real honor to introduce our speaker for tonight, and I'd like to take a couple minutes to do that, especially for the benefit of some of our younger people in the audience who may not have actually really experienced Senator Lugar as a senator. Richard G. Lugar, a fifth-generation Hoosier, is the longest-serving senator in Indiana history. He represented Indiana in the United States Senate for 36 years, from 1979 until 2013. A Republican, Lugar served as chair and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and was held in high esteem by his Democratic as well as Republican Senate colleagues and by Democratic as well as Republican presidents. He ran for president himself in 1996, with his party's nomination ultimately going to his Senate colleague, Bob Dole. Dick Lugar is an Eagle Scout. He was a Rhodes Scholar and an officer in the U.S. Navy before entering politics. Senator Lugar, or Dick Lugar, was a moral voice for desegregation as a young member of the Indianapolis School Board in the 1960s, and was a young first-term mayor of Indianapolis in 1968, when he played a critical role in keeping this city calm in the days following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., as most other cities in the United States erupted into violence. A vocal advocate for international human rights in the 1980s, Senator Lugar strongly supported sanctions against apartheid South Africa. When President Reagan vetoed the sanctions bill, Lugar bravely took to the floor of the Senate and challenged the president and senators from his own party and led the Senate in overriding President Reagan's veto of the South African sanctions bill. With the recent passing of President George H.W. Bush, a lot of attention has been rightly paid to President Bush's calm, steady leadership as the Soviet Union collapsed. A potentially chaotic situation with horrific global implications could have played itself out in the ensuing months and years as this nuclear-armed empire ceased to exist. But it wasn't just President Bush who helped chart a more peaceful path after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Senator Lugar played a pivotal role in the post-Soviet era. Working across the aisle with Democratic Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, the two men put together the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, an act that was signed by President Bush, which facilitated the decommissioning or destruction of Soviet nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons stockpiles, and the removal of the entire nuclear arsenals of 4 former Soviet republics. For these efforts, Nunn and Lugar were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The non-nuclear program continues today as a nuclear threat initiative, which has decommissioned over 7,000 nuclear warheads and is active in peacefully eliminating WMD, or weapons of mass destruction, all over the world. Just a few months ago, former Senators Nunn and Lugar wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about the implications of President Trump's talks with Kim Jong-un and North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Since leaving the Senate in 2013, Dick Lugar has served as president of the Lugar Center in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit organization focusing on global food security, weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation, foreign aid effectiveness, and bipartisan governance. The Lugar Center publishes the Bipartisan Index, which ranks every member of the House and Senate on their record of reaching across party lines to get things done. And I would add that when I take our Lugar Fellows to Washington, D.C. for spring break week, we always visit the Lugar Center in Washington and meet with Senator Lugar over there, and it's always a tremendous experience. Senator Lugar also serves as a professor of practice and a distinguished scholar at the School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. This October, IU renamed the school the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies in honor of Indiana's two elder statesmen, one a Republican and one a Democrat. And I should add that former Congressman Lee Hamilton is a two-time global studies speaker here at Marian University. Now, as it so happens, 11 years ago today, on December 9th, 2007, Marian University's Franciscan Center for Global Studies was renamed the Richard G. Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies. At that naming ceremony, attended by President Elsner, who's here in the audience tonight, Senator Lugar made the following statement, and I'd like to read that statement to you that he made 11 years ago tonight as we rename the center in his honor. Quote, "A global studies program is an affirmation that we are a part of a much larger world that is intellectual, scientific, and moral wisdom that we need to learn. Students who want to succeed and live to the fullest life possible must think globally. They must understand foreign cultures, the interdependence of the world economy, the fragility of the global environment, and many other factors that will affect their lives, even if they choose to devote their talents close to home. Beyond this general consideration," Senator Lugar said, "Marian University has the added imperative of fulfilling Franciscan traditions, which by their nature call for a community of learning to achieve the greatest possible respect and understanding of foreign cultures." Unquote. I believe that Dick Lugar's words ring more true today than they even did 11 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Senator Richard G. Lugar.
Pierre, thank you very, very much for that thoughtful introduction and for your extraordinary leadership. It's always a thrill to be at this great university. I've watched over the course of the 16 years of the lecture series, the growth. President Elsner has done a super job in my judgment, as has the professor who just introduced me. And I appreciate each one of you. Many of you have come several times to the lecture series and have worked along with us, thinking about this country and about the world, about our responsibilities as human beings. And tonight I want to touch upon four thoughts. This is a time in which many countries, not just one, but many countries, are rethinking their cooperation with others. It comes at a time in which we praise the values of the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, which came about because the United States really, until World War I and then World War II especially, was not involved in European warfare. We're not involved really in European affairs in a security sense for many good reasons. But we did become involved in the world after the attack on Pearl Harbor and our work then with the overall alliance that was formulated. And following World War II, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States and Canada, and a growing number of European countries that joined membership came together with the thought under Article 5 that if any one of them was ever attacked, the others would come to the rescue. That is a very substantial obligation, but it's one on which the European countries have counted for decades now at this particular point. I bring it up tonight because President Trump, during his first meeting over with the NATO leaders, did not indicate we were going to leave NATO, but he sharply criticized the NATO countries for not fulfilling their dues, the amount of money that they had pledged to the NATO alliance. And the president had a lot of validity in terms of his charge. Most of the European nations have not provided the dues that were anticipated, and many are not in a position to do so very soon. But in any event, it was a beginning, at least, of a conversation among many European countries. They noted when we were talking about America first, that French citizens could say France first, or Greece first, or Germany first, or what have you. We've had the situation in which in Great Britain, the British voted to leave the European Union. Now, the European Union is not NATO, but the European Union is sort of an economic equivalent of that. It brought together the European nations in a common bond that made trade much more possible, the enforcement of good business rules and so forth. It, in my judgment, has been very important in the growth of Europe in the post-World War II situation. But there are many countries now, and Britain has been the most dramatic illustration of this, in which its citizens have said, we're more concerned about what's happening in England, not what's happening in France or Germany or so forth. And so the so-called Brexit, it means an exit from the European Union, was a referendum issue and it passed. Not by much, but at least a solid majority. Now, for many, many months, as you've read, Prime Minister May of Great Britain has been trying to formulate some sort of an agreement that Great Britain will have with the rest of the European Union. That has been a very tough slog, and most people in the press, as you may have read in the last couple of weeks, believe that the resolution that she's going to bring before the Parliament will not pass. Furthermore, it's led some interesting and difficult conversations between the two Irelands, or between Scotland and England, or all of the aspects even within the British Isles, as people begin to think of ourselves first, and not the consolidation, the value of having a wider circle. I have no prediction of what will occur if Brexit does not pass, that is, the May resolution. Some believe it means the end of her prime ministership. Some believe that it's conceivable there might be another referendum. But I mention this because it is very much a part of the world in which we live right now. It's a dramatic one. In France, the new leader, Mr. Macron, is in great difficulty because, for one thing, he suggested that there ought to be a carbon tax. Well, that came about because something we'll discuss in a few more minutes, the Paris Agreement with regard to climate change. But many citizens are saying, well, that's not our problem. We don't want a tax. We really don't want, as a matter of fact, necessarily to be involved in the so-called Paris Agreement, which deals with climate change, and on and on. I won't dwell on the subject, but I would just say that this is a time in which we're going to have to offer, I hope, from the United States standpoint, substantial diplomacy that says it is very important that NATO hold together. It is very important specifically because President Vladimir Putin in Russia has been sort of testing out, are there at least some possibilities to engender some nationalist feeling in Russia by having activities that may be threatening to some NATO nations. We already have seen problems, and Ukraine, not a NATO nation, but of course, a long-time neighbor to Russia, in which Crimea was taken over. The first time that territory had been taken over since World War II. The Russians likewise became very active in the eastern part of Ukraine, still probably are active, even with denials, as they try to engender some trust and ties with Russian-speaking people out there who feel closer to Russia, they believe, than Ukraine and so forth. The Baltic states, who are members of NATO, to say the least, are very worried about this. If you were in Lithuania or Latvia, you are up against the Russian boundary at a time in which the Russian initiative may be somewhat more assertive. So I start tonight by talking about the importance of NATO, the importance of what I hope will be Great Britain staying in the European Union or as close to it as possible. My hope that the European Union will remain reasonably sound, in fact, hopefully will grow a bit stronger in support of the political aspects of a unified Europe. And I say this in view of many of you who have much history, background, that really until we finished off World Wars I and II, there had not been, prior to that, 50 years of time there had not been a war in Europe. The peace that has come to the continent, to that general part of the world, is really awesome in comparison to the historical precedent. Now, in addition to the European situation, we have, secondly, a problem which the President took a look at NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is not a military agreement, it's a trade agreement. It's with the United States, Canada, and Mexico, our two partners, at least, on this continent. Very important, in my judgment, not only in terms of political cooperation, but economic cooperation, to say the least. And the President characterized this as a terrible treaty, a terrible idea, and indicated that we were going to leave NAFTA. Well, we have not left NAFTA at this moment. There has been a negotiation that has proceeded. The President believes that he has deserved some credit for making some changes in our relationship with Canada and with Mexico, and that this is constructive and good. But at the same time, it's not really clear at this point that the Congress is going to accept the new treaty. Now, at that point, the President said, okay, if the Congress does not accept it, we're leaving NAFTA altogether. There'll be no treaty. So this is going to be sort of a breathtaking experience in terms of our own continent in the next 60, 90 days or what have you, as this either plays out in a constructive way with the new Congress as it's coming in, quite apart from how the Mexicans and the Canadians take a look at this. These situations are not without faults in many ways. There are many agricultural groups in the United States that feel mistreated by either Canada or Mexico, maybe other trade groups of various sorts. But at the same time, it has been very, very helpful to have this high degree of unity on our own continent. I hope it will be preserved. The thought of abruptly leaving it all and not being at the table would be very, very disappointing, to say the least. On top of that, we have, and I've touched upon it briefly, a much more complex situation beyond trade with the climate exchange controversy. Now, each of you may have your own views as to what scientists have had to say about climate change and its implications for life in America or life in the world. A large majority of the scientific community who have studied this issue now for several years believe, as a matter of fact, that the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere is going to bring about an increase in very violent storms that come often unexpectedly, but when they do come, really are ravishing with regard to whatever areas they may hit. It also has clearly caused a rise in the oceans of 6 to 7 inches. Now, some may say, well, that's not very much along all the coasts that there are in the world, but the increase is higher in many situations. And as a result, when there are actual storms, when there is a huge amount of rainfall, the water rises well beyond the 6 or 7 inches. It brings about enormous flooding, enormous problems. I can remember going to a conference of senators on this subject maybe 10 years ago. I was struck because I had served as mayor of Indianapolis and was well aware of the problems that many mayors have in our state with creek beds or lakes or various water situations. What it means if there are floods, what it means really to life in the community, even if for a fairly short while of weeks or months, not for years. But the facts of life are, of course, that as the water rises, there are many islands around the world that are going to be submerged. The populations will simply have to move. There will be all sorts of implications up and down our coasts for people who live there, many of them happily now with beautiful homes and all sorts of situations. This is occurring now, not just predicted in the future. Likewise, as I say, with regard to the storms and the other weather aspects, these are difficult to estimate or even to describe, but we've seen recently in our country some rather awesome storms. We've seen some rather awesome fires where through climate change, areas have been dried out abnormally, and the possibilities of fires that are very difficult to put out over periods of time are occurring even in our country, quite apart from the rest of the world. This is why almost all the nations of the world, and by that I mean almost 200 different entities, came together in Paris well over a year ago and formulated a so-called Paris Agreement. Now, scientists may not be absolutely accurate, and I'm not going to go through all of the Fahrenheit and Celsius readings tonight because no need for you to keep your notepads out trying to do the arithmetic, but in short, the predictions are that we cannot have any more increases in CO2 emissions, or we are going to move into danger zones with regard to the effects of climate change. For 2 years, 2016, 2017, there was a fairly stable situation in the world in terms of increase of CO2. But this year, in which we're now in 2018, there has been a substantial increase. And the facts of life are that if we are to be safe, there cannot be any more increases. Now, how do you mitigate the situation? Well, many countries adopted formulas, goals for their countries. And many of them had very substantial goals to try to bring about changes in terms of the use of coal, for example, even some mitigation in the use of oil and natural gas, the other so-called fossil fuels. These are all controversial items just on the face of it, but nevertheless, they are very much a part of it. Alternatively, countries thought, how much more can we get from solar energy? How much can we get from wind energy? How much can we get from atomic energy of various sorts as replacements for this? These are not brand new ideas. I can remember visiting schools in Indiana a few years ago where there were some very creative teachers and students. I remember one high school, I think it was in Zionsville, in which they were, in fact, going to try out solar energy, put solar plates on top of the school buildings and the other situations, try to get the electricity in that school from their solar plates as opposed to more conventional utility means. And we're having some success, and we're enjoying it. Even more to the point, I remember going to Warren Central High School. There was a teacher there who had a general maxim, turn off the lights, turn off the lights. The thought that if young people went home and they had opportunities, they should turn off the lights in their own homes and elsewhere as rapidly as possible, so the use of energy would decline and so forth. We've had all sorts of thoughts of these sorts. There'll have to be a good many more, because at the recent conference that our president attended in Argentina of the group of 20, the 20 largest nations of the world, 7 nations who had put up goals at the time of the Paris Agreement found that they had some distance to go to meet those goals. Many countries were embarrassed and didn't want to report at all. They just simply did not see really any good effects occurring presently. Now, what does this mean? If I were talking tonight to a group of students who have hopefully 50, 60, 70 years of life still ahead of them, this is going to be a very different kind of life if the predictions of scientists come true, and we have a world that is totally disrupted continually by violent weather, violent floods and water situations, other aspects of climate change. For many of us, things may get worse, but we're going to live through it and find this very sad. But if you're a young person and you're looking at that world ahead of you, that's a very different question. And this is why it's so important for young people to attack this problem, to understand their quality of life in this country or around the world is at stake, and that we need to be at it. Now, for the moment, unfortunately, the president withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, the only country in the world that simply backed out altogether. I hope he will change his mind, but for the moment, he has indicated a lot of this is a lot of hoax. Even at the time that scientists coming out of the White House, and there have been some very good reports recently, very comprehensive, people from federal agencies who have been doing work that was countenanced and encouraged by the White House have come to other conclusions. But I lay it before you tonight because this is the part of the world in which we live. It's one in which there is going to have to be a great deal of unity among countries so that the Chinese, for example, do not spill out CO2 in every direction, or the country of India or other countries that are not really prepared to deal with this. We're all on the same planet, and the implications for all of us are very substantial. This is why, from the beginning tonight, I've encouraged the thought of international cooperation, of the strength of NATO or NAFTA or the EU or other countries coming together at the Paris Agreement. So we're going to have to talk to each other. We're going to have to come to some common aims because we have a relatively small planet in this great universe. Now finally, let me just touch upon a thought that Pierre Atlas has mentioned. And that is that one of the good things that has occurred in our world in recent years has been the reduction of nuclear weapons. The death of President George W. Bush this week does remind us that he did sign the Non-Nuclear Cooperative Threat Reduction Act. As a matter of fact, had been very active personally in negotiations with the Russians and with others prior to that coming about in 1991. I mention the Property Threat Reduction Act, the non-nuclear business, because it was a big part of my political life and something that I will always remember sort of vividly year by year. President Reagan thought that perhaps he was going to be able to strike a deal with the Russians back in 1986 in Geneva, Switzerland. And he asked, as I recall, about 16 members of the Senate, both parties, to go to Geneva and go for perhaps quite a period of time. I was one of those that was selected because I was either chairman or ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee at the time. But the leadership, Bob Byrd and Bob Dole and others were there. And essentially the thought was that for the first time, we would try to get some accurate idea of the size of the nuclear armaments of the Soviet Union. And they likewise would get some idea of the size of ours, and we would begin to negotiate the reduction of those arms. Well, it didn't happen in 1986. The situation fell through, but while Sam Nunn and I were in Geneva, and we got to know each other much better during that period of time, we visited with Russians over at the Russian consulate. And then we sort of followed through during subsequent trips to Europe and Russia and what have you in the following 5 years, in which we found that the Russians were much more forthcoming than we had seen. They told us how the Soviet Union was deteriorating rapidly, so that we had a pretty good idea of the economic problems as well as the military problems. In 1991, however, we reached a point at which a group of the Russians that we had been visiting with from time to time came to Washington in the fall of 1991. They met around a round table in the office of Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia. And Sam and I were there with these Russians who were very candid. I remember one of the Russians looked at me in the eye and said, "You folks in the United States are in a lot of trouble." And I said, "What do you mean?" And so he said, "Well, the arms that are aimed at you, that is the warheads on top of missiles filled with nuclear material, are no longer being guarded in some cases. The troops in Russia have deserted because they have not been paid. As a result, there could be an accident, or there could be terrorists or others who do not wish us well." Now, I had come to realize that we had developed nuclear warheads, as had the Russians, that were so powerful, so far beyond what happened in Hiroshima when we used nuclear weapons there against the Japanese, that maybe 1, 2, or 3 of those warheads would be enough to simply wipe out Indianapolis, Indiana, off the face of the earth. That if you had 10,000 of them, as the Russians did, they had the ability really to knock out all of our cities and all of our military installations. But we also had built up a stock that was equivalent to theirs, to knock out about everything they had. It was what some called a period of mutually assured destruction possibility. Now, we had certainly thought that in both cases we were guarding weapons that we had. There was supervision of this. But that was rather awesome that there might not be in Russia at various points. So I said, "What do you want from us?" And the Russians said, "We're going to need a lot of your money, for one thing. We're going to need a lot of your trained personnel who know how to take down missiles and warheads and take material out of warheads. We hope we don't need your troops by the time we're finished, but we're in a situation of peril in terms of the future of the Soviet state. Now, this was the beginning of the so-called Non-Nuclear Cooperative Threat Reduction Act. We had the benefit of Ash Carter, who later became our Secretary of Defense, is now at the Belfer School at Harvard again, who wrote a so-called white paper, a very technical paper that was very helpful in formulating legislative language that we presented rapidly in the fall. We did not have time simply for a bill that was all by itself. We added as an amendment to an appropriation bill of some sort. And it did not have unanimous consent. Many people in my Republican Party said, not a dime for the Russians. They don't deserve a dime given all they have done. I said, well, that's not the case. The problem is, if we don't finance the takedown of these weapons, it's not going to happen. American taxpayer funds are going to have to be involved, and a lot of them, as a matter of fact, a controversial issue all by itself. In any event, non-nuclear passed. President Bush, at that time, H.W. Bush, signed it, although he was somewhat skeptical, I was told. Now, he never talked to me about it specifically. But I had the feeling that some in the White House said, who are these guys, Nunn and Lugar? What kind of audacity do they have to be dealing with the Russians and all of this nuclear business and so forth? So as a result, we invited some of his chief staff members to fly with us to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus the following month. And we saw the case of these particular situations unguarded and other difficulties of that sort. As I've often said, we all got religion together. We saw really what the problem was. And that really changed the attitude of everybody in Washington. But it meant that for the better part of 20 years, I was responsible, after Sam left the Senate, of getting the money each year, appropriated by different kinds of Congresses, as the political parties changed, as the presidents changed, and what have you. We were successful in doing that. Now we've come to a point in which we passed the last time a treaty called the New START Treaty. That was passed in December of 2011. It finally limits the number of warheads the Russians have and we have to 1,550 each. Not 10,000, but still 1,550. A pretty fair number. It was a very tough go at that particular point. For a variety of political reasons, many Republicans did not want to pass anything during the Obama administration. And we sort of went round and round in this. I was, at that point, by December of 1991, very close to the end of my political career in the Senate. About 5 months later, an adverse election in Indiana meant the end of the trail. But in any event, we got the job done in that year, 2011, and we got the type of treaty with Russia that I think is very, very important. Now, it came on top of another treaty called the INF Treaty, which is the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. This deals with missiles that are on the ground but have a range of 300 to 4,000 miles, not the intercontinental ballistic missiles that we were dealing with Russia before. And that treaty has been very important because it meant that the Russians and the United States, and anybody else for that matter, were prohibited really from building facilities in which they could take shorter shots at various other countries, one European country against another, or the Russians against another, or so forth. I think it's a very important treaty. Now, unfortunately, it appears the Russians have violated the treaty. It appears that they, in fact, have built a facility or facilities that may make it possible for them to have an intermediate range missile capability. So the president has taken the position that either the Russians stop that and get rid of it, or we are going to leave the INF treaty. That would be a real tragedy in my judgment, but nevertheless, that's what we're facing for the moment. The Russians have shown no signs, really, of moving very fast with regard to all of that. But it's a potentially dangerous situation. I lay it before you tonight because it's very different from foreign trade, very different from NATO and the alliances, but still very critical. We've taken for granted for many years we've been moving in a direction of less threat of nuclear weapons and threats that we could not have anticipated. Now, my hope is that we are going to negotiate successfully with the Russians. My hope certainly is we will not leave the treaty within 60 days or 90 days, or whatever the president has suggested. That, it seems to me, would be once again a precipitous move that has great dangers for us. But I take this opportunity of this wonderful lecture series, and each one of you who is serious students of government and foreign affairs, to lay before you these complex problems this evening. They're very much on my mind and heart, and in the various ways that I can be helpful, I'm trying to do so. And in one way is to express these thoughts to you as citizens of Indiana who have leadership and who have made means of expressing your thoughts. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. Thank you very much.
If the president were to continue to pursue dropping arrangements with other countries, to ignore all of the words from the scientists about climate change, and to do these things that you've recognized and commented on as being not very good, would those be impeachable problems?
In my first judgment, these would not be impeachable problems. They do not, to the best of my knowledge, violate specific American statutes or American law. They're questions of judgment. And in the case of the president, he might very well say they're really a part of his bargaining process with either the Congress or with other countries. In other words, that he is utilizing these more drastic moves of cutoffs or termination or what have you as a debating tool. So this leads me to believe that, serious as they are, and I believe they are not impeachable in the sense that we think of impeachment of presidents.
Sir, on the another important question of the relationship of the United States and China, I know there are some changes lately. To be sure, where do we go from now? I know lots of people have some idea that China did not change as many people expected. The question will be, what options would we really have? Can they change? Are they possible for them to change, or what can we do? Thank you.
The question is about changes in China. My guess is that we have already imposed, in many cases, fairly substantial economic sanctions upon China. These have caused economic pain. They're very visible, and the Chinese understand that. And that has not changed their minds in every respect, but they understand that not only we, but the rest of the world could take that point of view. So this leads many to believe that the Chinese are going to negotiate with President Trump or with other countries for that matter to begin to work out things in a more satisfying way. We hope that that will happen soon. The thought has been, as you read, the president predicting, I think, from time to time, in the next 60 days, or maybe the next 90 days. Well, it doesn't appear to me that things are likely to move that fast. But at the same time, it does appear that there is a negotiation situation in that some Chinese leaders are visiting with American leaders, that there is some conversation as opposed to everybody simply blanking everybody out. And one big reason is that things are not going altogether well in the Chinese economy right now. There are some problems, maybe beyond our comprehension or our measurement, but we get evidence of this in terms of data that are available in the world community. And so it may be in the best interest of China to get rid of this whole host of tariffs that we are implying, not just to soybeans and aluminum and cars, but tens of things, to get beyond that point now and get back to business. Now, this is going to lead to all sorts of complex issues in the United States. For example, as we saw in the past week with General Motors, the closure of 4 automobile factories, 2 of them in Ohio. General Motors has been producing a lot of cars in China for a long time. Some of these have been exported back to the United States, maybe a good many for that matter. In other words, international trade has taken situations in which American companies have made investments in other countries, or they've come into mergers of corporations with other countries. And that has worked out reasonably well in some cases. This has led now to this question of, in the process of this, are the Chinese stealing intellectual property? Are they trying to, as a matter of fact, find out how we did some things mechanically or communication-wise and co-opt that? And those are even more complex problems than simply the economics. That's a part of the debate we've gotten into in the past week.
Thank you for thank you for your talk. I was wondering, what do you think of the Mueller investigation so far, and where do you think we're going with it, and what will be the implications?
It appears that the Mueller investigation may be moving toward, if not a conclusion, at least some reports. We know, of course, already of certain persons who have been indicted, and in fact, a couple convicted of situations that were involved in the last election, or lying about it, colluding in various ways. It's very difficult to judge at this point what the nature of that report is going to be, how much accusation there will be with regard to the president personally, or to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or whoever else may be involved really in it. And that's why speculation is not very helpful in this respect. It is better, in my judgment, to allow Mr. Mueller to complete his investigation very carefully and very thoroughly, to prepare the hundreds of pages of testimony and papers that will be required for everybody to study who is involved in this and interested in this, not only members of Congress, but the press, and each one of us for that matter. But it will have a considerable impact in various ways that are unknowable, because it's very clear that the Russians in various ways were involved in the last election. And the Russians, as a matter of fact, have tried to become involved in several elections around the world. Ours was not an exclusive target with regard to their interests. They've become much more adept, given communication devices of the social media or what have you in presenting ideas, many of them false or accusatory in ways that were difficult. So this is going to be very complex when the Mueller investigation finally gets there. The amount of sophisticated argument about this is likely to last for quite a long while.
So you had a question? Okay.
Yeah, first, I'd like to thank you for all you've done in service to our country. But I would ask you, since these problems are complex and won't be solved tomorrow, what advice would you give, or what are the defining qualities you say would tell our youth that we need in great leaders, from your opinion?
Well, yesterday I had the privilege at the University of Indianapolis of addressing, as I have each year for the last 42 years, students from most of the high schools around Indiana. Over 70 counties were represented, 3 students from each of the high schools that were there. These are students who were selected by their teachers as potential leaders in the future. And the first point that I made is that I hope each one of these students will try to perfect their expression skills, their ability to speak, their ability to write, their ability to in essence, make arguments and opinions that are constructive and be able to advise and to counsel with potential constituents or whoever may be in the circle in which they may have some degree of influence. I think this ability of expression is tremendously important to supplement in a very big way the academic experience, the thought of a wide-ranging number of studies that may be a part of their high school and college careers. I'm very pleased, of course, here at Marian University, the number of students who are involved, really, in studying other countries, in thinking about the world generally. I'm pleased that that's occurring in many high schools in Indiana, as a matter of fact. I'm pleased that there are many students who are thinking very thoughtfully about the social media, about communication generally, about cyber warfare or what cyber means in this world. In other words, for many students, this is a more sophisticated curriculum than we had when I was attending Shortridge High School here in Indianapolis. It's a different world, but it requires different preparation. And I asked them to do this because I hope at the end of the trail that many of them will be prepared to offer leadership. Now, it may not always be as a member of the school board, of the city council, or a congressman, or what have you. It could happen in many different ways. But they will offer a portion of their time, a portion of their lives to help others, and to do so really with very strong intellectual property background and the ability to express those thoughts to others.
Yes.
Senator Lugar, thank you. I wonder, are there any kind of parameters that we can put on the social media, Facebook, Twitter, tweet? We have freedom of speech, but what can we do to limit it going so fast with destructive and often untrue comments?
We've not yet worked out something comparable to what we've had with regard to the conventional press. I heard a lecture by a reporter, a distinguished reporter from the New York Times a couple of years ago, in which he made the point that stories that he writes for the New York Times and that are published there are examined very carefully by his editors and by fact checkers and others, because if they are not and they publish material that is wrong, and they can be sued, they can be held liable and in criminal cases with regard to that. He made the point that in most cases in the so-called social media, there is not this type of fact-checking. There is not the responsibility of the editors. At this point, it's not really clear exactly what the legal bounds are as to if you simply publish or somehow put out material on social media that is a lie, that is libelous. Exactly what the legal implications of that may be. I think that's a very important point we're going to have to work through because I think the folks who manage Facebook now understand, and they have been attempting to monitor somewhat what all is occurring out there, and to try to bring things into some parameters. But it's a long way to go. And in this manner, we've talked about the Russians and the Mueller investigation, for example. Not only the Russians, but any country that does not wish us well could use our social media to propagate lies and mistruths and very dangerous thoughts that have implications for us. And the question is, how is the editing going to occur? How does responsibility under the law occur? And we have some distance to go in that direction.
Senator, you speaking to your high school students, and in this and other areas, the media has been, the mainstream media has been denigrated substantially. So the confidence in the traditional media. But also, as you're talking to these high school students, and when we look at the dismantling, to the degree that it has been dismantled, of the State Department, and the rapid turnover in executive leadership in the departments of the government of the United States, how do you see the encouragement for people to enter these fields and for them to be able, particularly in the field of government, to be able to communicate foreign relations, public service in the future?
I think they understand it will require courage, but likewise it requires accuracy of expression. I've stressed again the thought that I remember as a high school debater beginning the discipline that came if I had a 5-minute rebuttal situation. And in my mind's eye, I would have Roman numeral 1 and A and B and 2 and A and B and try to discipline my own thoughts so that I would get within 5 minutes and have tried to make the points. I'm suggesting this to students that this kind of discipline is going to be required for them to be effective leaders, but likewise to stay within legal bounds. They're going to have to be very thoughtful about the language and the content. And I think they understand that. I think there's a different world maybe than there was when I was a high school student.
Senator, over the past several years, we've seen so many governments around the world get to be increasingly in debt. Over the past several years, governments, US, Europe, and China have become racked up increasing amounts of debt. How do you see this influencing international relations in the future and the economy and stability?
The debts usually lead to, obviously, not only change of government, but instability for the countries that are involved. And this is why we have had organizations such as the World Bank or various international groups that have been in a position to come to the rescue, at least in terms of smaller economies. Because it has been perceived that the stability of even larger economies depends upon at least shoring up situations. I'm not in a position tonight to outline all the ways in which countries that head toward bankruptcy are rescued. But nevertheless, several have been and have been on the brink of disaster, but brought back, usually through intervention of international banks or neighboring countries, who at least took hold of portions of the economy and portions of the debt until there could be a change maybe in leadership of the country or a change in circumstances. I don't know how to express it any better than that. I think that if a major country were to go into bankruptcy, it's not really clear where the rescue is. There would just be enormous suffering, and a lot of people would not have income for health care, for food, for various other things, and it would be a total disaster.
We have a reception afterwards with some light refreshments where you could spend a couple of minutes and meet with Senator Lugar. I would like to take the prerogative of asking the final question, if that's all right. You gave a very cogent, well-organized talk identifying 4 major points. The importance of NATO and international institutions with Europe, free trade and NAFTA, the importance of science and climate change, and the importance of arms reduction treaties. And all of those positions today are quite different than where the Republican Party stands. And I'd like to maybe, if you can just sort of think a little bit, especially coming, now we've had the midterm election, wither the Republican Party. What has happened to the Republican Party that you used to represent? All of these positions that you've outlined, which I think I'm in full agreement with. I think they're very rational and internationalist and American leadership, long-standing. Many of it has been bipartisan for 70 years. What has happened, and what do you see of the future of the Republican Party?
Well, I think it's less the future of the Republican Party than the particular thoughts of the president and his expression. In other words, the president has been a very able businessman. He has been bargaining with people around the world for years with a great deal of success. Unfortunately, at least in my judgment, he did not come to the presidency with the same qualifications, say, as George Herbert Walker Bush. We've been thinking a lot about that in the past week, who had been involved in the State Department, who had been involved in CIA, who had been a member of Congress. In other words, for a president to encompass just the thoughts that I've had this evening on these particular issues, this requires a great deal of study. If you haven't had experience in dealing with these issues at some time prior to being president, you've got to learn very fast, or at least surround yourself with persons who know a great deal about it and in whom you have trust. I think that in due course, the president probably will improve in this respect. I am not going into a blanket condemnation. I'm just suggesting that, for example, with the NAFTA business, the president dismisses this as one of the worst treaties he's ever heard of, and what have you. But then within a few weeks comes back and is negotiating another NAFTA treaty, which he thinks is a good one. Now, at this point, of course, the Congress, somehow disturbed by the first allegations and so forth, may indicate that they're somewhat reticent, and it may simply be special interests. Maybe sugar farmers or chicken farmers or whoever is dealing with Mexico or Canada or what have you doesn't like the particular treaty the president has drawn up now, decides this is a good chance to play hardball with the president about all this. So then the president bargains again. I'm okay, out of NAFTA altogether, just finished. Well, that won't work. We need to have a relationship with Canada and China and Mexico. So it's a matter of style. of his personal experience, the style that he uses, and which hopefully there are some mitigating circumstances of his advisors or members of Congress or the press or others who at least argue things back onto the track. I pray that will be the case in each of these situations. This is why, in the case, for instance, of the nuclear treaty tonight that I mentioned that he was talking about dismissing, very quickly Sam Nunn and I wrote op-eds that papers published around the country, and we've done so with regard to other situations. Others do it. It doesn't mean that because we write something necessarily people are going to agree with all of it, but it offers them at least some basis for thinking through the problem, offers members of Congress perhaps some arguments they might be able to utilize in the checks and balances of our country.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Pierre.